There is a particular afternoon that stays with you. Though you could not have known it mattered at the time, you were in the middle of something ordinary. Standing in the kitchen, maybe, or sitting at the table with a cup of something that had gone cold, when someone called your name and asked you a question you had never been asked before. Not a difficult question on the surface. Practical, almost small. Something about a bill, or a decision, or who should handle a certain thing that had always been handled by someone else. You answered, probably carefully, probably slower than usual, and when the moment passed, life continued the way it does. Dishes in the sink, light through the window, the ordinary sounds of the house moving around you. But something had shifted, quietly, without announcement, the way most real changes happen. A line had been crossed that you had not seen drawn. You think about that afternoon sometimes. Not with grief, not with regret exactly, more with a kind of quiet recognition. The feeling of looking back at a door you walked through without noticing it was there. Because that is how responsibility finds most people. Not in a moment of ceremony, not when someone sits you down and says, "Now things are different." It arrives in an ordinary afternoon, in a question asked without drama, in a pause before you answer that you did not know held any weight. And then you are on the other side of something. And the person who asked has already moved on, trusting you, which is its own kind of weight, the weight of being trusted before you have decided whether you are ready to be. The strange thing about readiness is that it almost never arrives first. Most people imagine it differently when they are younger, that there will be a feeling, clear and recognizable, that announces, "Now you are prepared, now you can carry this." That something inside will settle into place and the uncertainty will lift, and what remains will be solid ground. But the ground rarely settles that way. More often, the weight arrives first, and readiness, if it comes at all, builds quietly underneath it, not before the responsibility, but because of it. Not preparation, but accumulation. Not a moment of readiness, but a slow becoming, constructed from all the afternoons, when you handled something before you felt certain you could. What nobody tells you is that the question itself is only the beginning. The real weight is not in the answering. It is in what follows. The quiet understanding that you will be asked again. That there is now an assumption, gentle and unspoken, living inside the house, inside the relationship, inside the ordinary way people look at you and reach for you when something needs to be decided. You did not apply for this. You were not interviewed. You were simply present and capable enough. And so the weight found you the way weight always finds the person closest to it. That first question was not the last. It was only the first in a sequence that did not announce itself as a sequence, arriving instead in the unremarkable rhythm of days. That sequence has its own texture, its own particular weight. It does not come all at once. It builds the way a house fills with furniture, gradually, almost without you noticing, until one day you look around and realize there is no longer any empty space. 1 month it is a question about money. The next it is a phone call that used to go to someone else. Then a form that needs signing, an appointment that needs attending, a conversation that needs having with someone who is no longer able to have it the way they used to. Each thing arrives separately, modestly, as if apologizing for its smallness. But smallness accumulates. And somewhere in the accumulation, the shape of your days quietly changes. There is a kind of tiredness that comes not from doing one large thing, but from doing many small things across a long period of time. It is not the tiredness you feel after a sprint. It is the tiredness that arrives after months of steady carrying, when the body has learned to move under weight so naturally that it almost forgets the weight is there, until it stops and feels, suddenly, how much has been held. This is the tiredness that responsibility builds in people. Not dramatic, not visible from the outside. A tiredness that lives inside ordinary days, inside ordinary faces, inside the calm voice people use when they answer another question without letting anyone see what it costs. You learned, without being taught, how to look steady, how to answer in a tone that does not signal how uncertain you actually feel, how to receive a problem from someone else and carry it internally, processing it alone, returning only the answer, the finished version, the resolved version, the version that does not require the other person to know how much you held before you got there. This is a skill nobody names. It does not appear on any list of things adults are supposed to learn. But most people who carry responsibility know it intimately. The ability to absorb uncertainty without transmitting it, to receive weight and translate it quietly into the appearance of steadiness. And there is something in that steadiness that becomes expected. Not demanded, not asked for explicitly, just expected, the way furniture is expected to stay in the place it was put. You handled something well once, and so it became quietly understood that you would handle it again. You were calm during a difficult moment, and so calmness became associated with you, not as a quality you always feel, but as a quality others now count on. The expectation is rarely spoken. It does not need to be. It lives inside the way people call your name when something needs deciding, inside the way they look towards you in uncertain moments, inside the way certain conversations begin. I didn't know who else to ask. There is something in that phrase that holds both weight and warmth simultaneously. Being the person someone turns to is not nothing. To be trusted with something real, to be considered capable, to be the one reached for, there is a quiet dignity in that, even when the reaching arrives before you feel ready for it. Even when you answer the question and hang up the phone and sit for a moment in the silence after, feeling the particular weight of having said yes before you were sure, because the yes was real and it was given, and somewhere behind it was the knowledge that it was needed. That matters. That is not nothing. But mattering and being easy are not the same thing, and the weight of being needed does not lighten simply because the need is genuine. The calls still come at inconvenient moments. The decisions still arrive with incomplete information. The forms still require signatures. The conversations still require patience. The problems still require solutions that nobody has made obvious. And through all of it, there is you, answering, organizing, absorbing, translating uncertainty into something manageable enough to give back. Day after day, in the unremarkable, ordinary way that most invisible labor gets done. What makes this particular weight so quiet is that it rarely looks like anything from the outside. It does not announce itself the way more visible burdens do. There is no single moment of breaking, no obvious point of collapse, no dramatic scene that allows others to recognize what is happening. The carrying continues. The face remains calm. The voice remains steady. And the question arrives again tomorrow, and you answer it again. And the day moves forward the way days do. Ordinary, unremarkable, carrying everything inside it without showing any of it on the surface. The surface is where most people see you, and the surface is calm. But underneath the surface, there is a different experience happening, one that does not get reported, does not get discussed, does not get named in conversations with the people who rely on you. It is the experience of carrying something before you feel capable of carrying it. And carrying it anyway, not out of certainty, but out of the absence of another option. Someone had to, and you were there, and so you do. There is a question that lives inside this experience, one that rarely gets spoken aloud. It appears most often in quiet moments, late at night, or early in the morning, or in the car after a phone call, and it does not have a clean answer. The question is something like, when does this become something I chose, rather than something that simply happened to me? Because the original moment did not feel like a choice. It felt like an afternoon, and a question, and an answer that seemed reasonable at the time, and then another question, and then another. And somewhere in the accumulation of questions and answers, a life shaped itself around a role that was never formally accepted, only gradually assumed. This is not resentment exactly. Resentment implies a clear injury, a specific moment of harm, a thing that was taken that should not have been. But the weight of inherited responsibility does not usually arrive that way. It arrives gently. People who love you do the asking. People who trust you hand you their uncertainty because they believe you can hold it. And that belief, though sometimes heavy, is also a kind of love. The complication is not the love. The complication is that love and weight can occupy the same space at the same time, and the weight does not become lighter simply because the love is real. What accumulates slowly is a particular kind of private fatigue. Not toward the people, but toward the position. Fatigue at always being the steady one. At being the person whose calm is assumed rather than tended to. At being the one who handles things, which means also being the one who is expected to continue handling things, indefinitely, because there is no obvious end to the sequence, and no clear moment when someone will arrive to say, "We see what you have been carrying. You can put some of it down now." That moment does not come. The sequence continues, and you continue inside it, carrying, absorbing, answering, translating. And within that continuation, there are small private negotiations that happen without witnesses. Moments where you decide alone how much to show and how much to contain. Where you assess what the person asking needs to see from you, and you give them that version, the capable version, the composed version, the version that does not add its own uncertainty to an already uncertain situation. This is a daily interior labor that leaves almost no trace. No one records it. No one recognizes it as effort. Because the effort, if it succeeded, looked like ease. And ease from the outside requires no acknowledgement. Somewhere inside all of it, a quieter question waits. Not the loud version of the question, not the one that protests or grieves or demands to be heard. The quieter version, the one that surfaces only in stillness, only when the day has ended and the house is settled, and there is no one asking anything of you anymore. It is not a dramatic question. It has no urgency, no heat. It only wonders softly, was I ever asked if I was ready? Or did readiness simply become me, because the alternative was to leave something uncared for? And the answer to that question, in most cases, is not one that changes anything. But it is still worth noticing that the question exists, that it lives there, quietly, at the end of ordinary days, in the person whose surface the world reads as steady. There is a version of adulthood that looks, from the inside, nothing like what was imagined from the outside of it. When you are younger and looking forward, responsibility appears as something you step into, deliberately, with some measure of preparation, with a sense that you have arrived at a stage you chose. The version that actually happens is quieter and less ceremonial. It accumulates. It gathers itself around you the way weather gathers, gradually, without formal announcement, until you look up one day and the sky is completely different from what it was. The gathering happens in layers. The first layer is practical, the things that need doing that nobody else is positioned to do. A document, a call, a form, a decision about something that could not wait. You handle it. It gets handled. This is the layer most visible to others, the layer of tasks and outcomes, of problems and solutions. But beneath the practical layer, there is a second layer that accumulates more slowly and makes far less noise. This is the layer of emotional presence, the being relied upon not just for tasks, but for tone, for steadiness, for the particular quality of calm that allows others to remain calm. You become, gradually, not just the person who handles things, but the person whose handling of things keeps other people's anxiety from expanding. This is a different kind of labor. Invisible, interior, continuous. And beneath that second layer, there is a third, the layer that has to do with identity. Because somewhere in the long accumulation of being the one who handles, of being the one who is calm, of being the one who answers, a self assembles itself around those qualities. Not by choice, not by decision, by repetition, by the slow solidification of role into character. And then one day you look at yourself and realize that much of what feels like who you are was actually shaped by what was needed. That the dependable person, the calm person, the person others reach for, that person was not entirely invented from within. It was also constructed by the weight of being needed and by the long practice of carrying. This realization does not have to be a wound. It does not have to be a source of grief. It can simply be a recognition, a quiet noticing of the distance between the self that might have formed without the weight and the self that actually formed with it. These are not always radically different. Often the person you became under responsibility is someone you would have chosen had you been given the explicit choice. The problem is not the person. The problem is only the absence of the choice, the sense that the shaping happened to you more than through you, that the role arrived before the person was finished and the person had to finish themselves inside the role rather than before it. There are moments when this becomes most apparent, usually not the large moments, not the genuine crises, not the acute difficulties that demand clear action and leave no room for reflection. The weight becomes most visible in the small pauses, in the moment between receiving a problem and beginning to address it, that brief, private space where you feel the full measure of what is being handed to you before you begin translating it into something manageable. In the evening, after a long sequence of days where the carrying continued without acknowledgement. In the quiet of a room where nobody is asking anything and the silence feels less like peace and more like a temporary absence of demand. Most people who carry this kind of responsibility do not talk about it this way, not because they cannot name it, but because naming it feels like complaining, and complaining feels like a failure of the role. If you are the steady one, expressing unsteadiness threatens the structure that others depend on. And so, the weight gets carried internally. The feeling gets translated into the language of task completion, of things handled and situations managed. The interior experience, the uncertainty, the tiredness, the quiet question about readiness stays private. It belongs to the hours after the calls end and the forms are filed and the decisions are made, and there is nothing left to handle for the moment. What is hardest to articulate, and what most people in this position carry, without a name for it, is the particular loneliness of being relied upon. It is not the loneliness of isolation, of having no one. It is the loneliness of being the person other people's stability rests on, which means there is a version of yourself, the uncertain version, the unready version, the version still figuring things out, that does not get to be fully present in relationships where you are needed. That version goes quiet when someone reaches for you, because what they need is the capable version, and you give them that because you can, because someone has to, because the alternative is a problem that gets larger without being addressed. But the other version, the one that also sometimes does not know, that also sometimes wishes someone else would take the question for a moment, that version exists. It is real. It has weight of its own. And it is not nothing to recognize that. Not a resolution, not a solution, not the relief of being understood, necessarily, but something quieter and more honest, the acknowledgement that inside the person others read as steady, there is an interior life that moves differently than the exterior suggests. That steadiness is often not the absence of uncertainty, but the presence of something else alongside it, a willingness or a discipline, or simply the accumulated practice of continuing to answer even when the answer is not entirely certain. That the readiness that was never fully present at the beginning has been constructed, quietly, out of all the times you showed up for something before you felt ready for it. Built not in advance, but in the living of it, assembled not from preparation, but from the long, ordinary accumulation of answering, carrying, continuing. The weight of it does not disappear with recognition, but recognition changes its texture slightly. The tiredness remains, the questions remain. The sequence of days that require handling continues. But there is something in seeing it clearly, in being willing to look at the afternoon when it all began, and the sequence that followed, and the self that assembled itself inside the sequence, that is different from not seeing it. Not better exactly, not easier, just more honest. And honesty, even quiet honesty, even the kind that changes nothing external, has a weight of its own that is somehow different from the weight of what it names. The evening eventually quiets. The calls end. The questions, for tonight at least, stop arriving. And in that pause, brief and impermanent as it always is, there is a particular stillness that belongs to people who carry this kind of weight. Not the stillness of rest exactly, more the stillness of temporary absence. The world is quiet for a moment. Nothing is being asked of you. And in that space, without the structure of task and response to hold the shape of the day, something releases slightly. Not all the way, not completely, but enough to feel that there is a person underneath the role, a person who arrived at an ordinary afternoon years ago and answered a question and kept answering, and is still here, still answering, still carrying. That person is not entirely different from who they imagined being. but they are shaped in ways they did not entirely choose. There is a kitchen that has been stood in late at night more times than can be counted, working through something in silence. There is a phone that has rung at inconvenient moments and been answered anyway. There are forms and decisions and conversations that arrived before any sense of readiness, and were handled not because the handling was easy, but because there was no one else, and because the alternative was to leave something uncared for. This is not a tragedy. It is an ordinary life, shaped by ordinary responsibility. But the shaping was real, and the weight was real, and the person who was built inside that weight is real. That person carries something that does not always have a name, but it does not need a name to be felt. It only needs to be noticed. And tonight, in the quiet, it is. And somewhere in the quiet of tonight, in the pause sequence, in the temporary stillness before tomorrow's questions arrive, that person sits with what has accumulated, not reviewing it, not judging it, only letting it exist, the way a room exists after the lights go out, still full of everything that was in it, only less visible now, resting in the dark. The house is the same house it was this morning. The phone is the same phone. The morning will bring the same sequence it always brings. But in this particular pause, there is at least the honesty of recognition that an ordinary afternoon once changed the shape of things, and that the person who answered that first question has been answering ever since. Quietly, before feeling ready, which is, in the end, how most of the real carrying gets done.